My name is Sana. Before you judge anything I did, you need to know where I started. I grew up in a house on Canal Road with a courtyard full of jasmine plants my mother refused to let anyone else water. My father, Imran, was a quiet, careful man who had built a construction supply business from nothing, a single rented warehouse when he was 23, 3 warehouses, and a small fleet of trucks by the time I was born. He wasn't a rich man by the standards of the city's real elite, but he was respected. People greeted him first when he walked into a room. That mattered to him more than money ever did. His closest friend, and the man he trusted most in the world, was Rustam Sheikh. They had known each other since college. Rustam was the smoother of the two, better with words, better with strangers, always the one who closed the deals my father was too honest to close. My father used to say, laughing, Rustam could sell sand to the desert. As a child, I liked Uncle Rustam. He brought me sweets from his trips abroad and called me Sana, my little accountant, because I used to sit at my father's desk pretending to add up numbers in a notebook. I did not know then that pretending would one day become my whole life. When I was 15, my father made Rustam a full partner in the business. It was meant to secure both their families for the next generation. Rustam had access to everything after that: the accounts, the contracts, the property deeds, the signatures. I found out much later, piecing it together over years, that Rustam had begun moving money almost immediately. Small amounts at first, hidden inside legitimate transactions. Then larger ones, routed through companies that existed only on paper, registered under names of relatives who had never set foot in the business. By the time my father noticed a pattern: a warehouse lease that didn't match the numbers, a shipment invoice that didn't match the shipment, nearly everything was already gone. My father confronted him. I wasn't in the room, but my mother told me later that he came home that night pale and silent, and did not eat dinner. 2 weeks after that conversation, he was killed in what the police report called a single vehicle accident on the Ring Road at 11 at night. No other car involved. No witnesses. My father, who had driven that same road 1,000 times, apparently lost control for no reason anyone could explain. I was 16. I remember standing at the funeral holding my little brother Bilal's hand. He was only 9, and watching Rustam Sheikh weep louder than anyone else there. He held my mother's hands in both of his and told her, in front of everyone, "Whatever you need, I am here." Imran was my brother. Within 4 months, our accounts were frozen due to outstanding business liabilities Rustam claimed my father had left behind. Within a year, the house on Canal Road was sold to cover those same liabilities. We moved into 2 small rooms above a tailor's shop on the other side of the city, taking with us only what could fit into the back of a borrowed van. I did not cry in front of anyone. Not once. I remember deciding, quite consciously, at 16 years old, that crying was a door I could not afford to open, because I did not know if I would be able to close it again. My mother, Nasreen, had never worked outside our home before. She was a woman who had spent her life managing a household, hosting guests, choosing fabrics for Eid. Now she sat at a sewing machine 12 hours a day, stitching hems for other people's clothes, her fingers cracking in the winter cold because we could not always afford to run the small heater. Bilal was too young to understand most of it, but he understood enough. He stopped asking about his old school. He stopped asking about his old room. He got quieter, the way children do when they learn that questions only make the adults around them sadder. I took whatever work I could find after school, tutoring younger children in math, helping the tailor downstairs with bookkeeping he didn't trust himself to do. I studied by streetlight when we couldn't afford electricity in the evenings, sitting on the concrete steps outside our building with a notebook balanced on my knees, mosquitoes circling the bulb above me. People in the neighborhood pitied us. I hated being pitied almost as much as I hated being poor. But I let them pity me, because a girl who is pitied is underestimated, and a girl who is underestimated is invisible, and invisibility, I would learn, is the most valuable tool a person can have. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that somewhere in the city, a man was sleeping in my father's stolen comfort, and that I intended to be the reason he eventually could not sleep at all. I finished secondary school at the top of my class, not because I was naturally the most brilliant student, but because I had nothing else to spend my anger on except books. My mathematics teacher, Miss Farah, was the first person outside my family who seemed to actually see me. She helped me apply for a full scholarship to study finance and accounting at the State University, writing recommendation letters late into the evening after her own classes were done. I got in. My mother cried when the letter arrived, the first time I had seen her cry since the funeral. I did not cry. I simply held the letter and thought, this is the first door. University was its own kind of war. I was surrounded by classmates who complained about tight deadlines while wearing watches that cost more than our monthly rent. I never told anyone my story. I let them assume I was simply a scholarship student who studied too hard, which was true, though not for the reasons they imagined. I did not choose finance because I loved numbers, although I came to respect them. I chose it because I had learned, at 16, that money is a language, and that the people who cannot read that language are the ones who get robbed in broad daylight and told it was an accident. I intended to become fluent. Interfield had, among its many clients, a group of companies that supplied construction materials across 3 cities. I did not recognize the group's public name at first. It took me 2 weeks of quietly cross-referencing old newspaper archives in the university library under the excuse of a research project before I understood what I was looking at. Rustam Sheikh had rebuilt my father's old business, using my father's old suppliers, my father's old contracts, and I suspected more of my father's original capital than anyone had ever accounted for. He had grown it into something 4 times larger than what my father had left behind. His name appeared in a business magazine that year under the headline Self-Made Success. How one man built an empire from the ground up. I read that sentence more times than I care to admit. I did not quit the internship. I did not confront anyone. I did something far more useful. I paid attention. I learned how audits were structured, and more importantly, I learned how they could be quietly avoided. I learned how shell companies were built to look legitimate on paper. I learned how signatures could be forged well enough to pass a glance but not a forensic review. I learned essentially the entire architecture of the crime that had been used against my father, not because I wanted to admire it, but because I understood that a house can only be properly demolished by someone who understands exactly how it was built. Alt text. I will not pretend the years that followed were dramatic. Revenge, in real life, does not look like the films. It looks like 8 years of unglamorous, patient work. I graduated and took a junior position at a different auditing firm, one with no ties to Rustam's businesses, so that my presence would never raise questions. I was promoted twice in 4 years, not because I sought attention, but because I was good at my job. Disturbingly good, the kind of good that comes from someone who has spent a decade rehearsing for exactly this. On weekends, I volunteered at a legal aid clinic that helped small business owners who had been defrauded by larger partners, partly because I wanted to help people who reminded me of my father, and partly, I admit now, because it taught me how such cases were built, argued, and won in court. I learned which regulatory bodies had teeth and which ones were merely decorative. I learned which journalists took financial corruption seriously and which ones could be bought. My mother eventually stopped stitching hems. I insisted on it the moment my salary allowed. Bill grew into a serious, watchful young man who studied law. Partly, he told me once, because he'd absorbed something from watching his older sister for all those years, even though I never told him exactly what I was doing. My family believed I had simply built a stable, respectable career. In a sense, I had. They did not know it was also a weapon I had been sharpening the entire time. I visited my father's grave every year on the anniversary of his death. I never brought flowers. I brought him updates instead, spoken quietly, as if he could hear me. I passed my certification, Baba. I got promoted. I found the first shell company today. He never answered, of course, but I always felt lighter walking away than I had walking in. By my early 30s, I had reached a senior position with genuine access, the kind of access that allowed me to request specific audits, review specific filings, and crucially, to be trusted with sensitive documents without anyone questioning why. It took another 18 months of careful, deliberate work to assemble what I needed. Records of the original shell companies used to drain my father's accounts, cross-referenced with the current structure of Rustam Sheikh's empire, which had never fully abandoned the same techniques, only refined them. Fraud, I learned, is rarely creative. Men who get away with it once tend to simply repeat themselves more confidently for the rest of their lives. I found forged signatures matching documents from 16 years earlier, structurally identical to fraud in his current filings. I found a nephew's name used as a director of a company that nephew had never heard of. I found a pattern of consulting fees paid to entities that did no consulting at all, bleeding value out of the company at the exact moments large loans came due. I did not act rashly. I consulted, quietly and separately, with two people I trusted completely: a former professor who had gone on to work with the National Financial Regulator, and Bilal, who by then was a junior lawyer with a sharp understanding of exactly which laws had been broken. Neither of them knew the full personal history behind my questions. I let them believe it was simply an interesting case. I want to be honest about something. There were nights, especially in my 20s, when I imagined simpler, uglier endings for Rustam Sheikh. I am not going to pretend those thoughts never existed. Grief, left alone in the dark for long enough, will imagine almost anything. But I kept returning to one memory, my father's own voice, from long before any of this happened, telling a younger version of me that a man who builds with lies eventually has to live inside what he built. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I understood it perfectly by the time I was 30. I chose paper over violence. I chose the same evidence and the same institutions that had failed my father the first time, but this time, wielded by someone who understood exactly how they worked and who had waited long enough to make no mistakes. I submitted the complete file, years of documentation, cross-referenced and legally sound, anonymously to the National Financial Regulator, through a channel Bilal helped me route safely, without either of us ever explicitly naming what we both, by then, quietly understood. I submitted a second, condensed version to a financial journalist who had a reputation for following stories that powerful men wanted buried. The investigation took 11 months. I watched it unfold from a careful distance, the way you watch weather approaching from far away, knowing exactly where it will land. Rustam Sheikh's companies were frozen pending investigation. Business partners who had spent 2 decades praising his brilliance distanced themselves within weeks. The same men who had called him a genius at industry dinners suddenly couldn't recall the details of their partnerships. His own nephew, facing charges himself for lending his name to shell companies' alt text he hadn't understood, testified against him to reduce his own sentence. Even his son, who had been groomed to inherit the empire, quietly began cooperating with investigators once it became clear that loyalty would cost him his own freedom. The story broke publicly under a headline I read 3 times before I could fully believe it: construction magnate Rustam Sheikh charged with decades of financial fraud. Rustam Sheikh had aged more than the years alone accounted for. His hands shook slightly as the judge read the sentence: restitution, asset seizure, and 8 years imprisonment for fraud, forgery, and financial crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. As they led him out in handcuffs, his eyes swept briefly across the gallery. They passed over me without pausing. He had no idea who I was. He had, I suspect, mostly forgotten my father's name. Standing there, I did not feel triumphant, the way I had once imagined I would. I felt, more than anything, quiet, the particular quiet of a very long debt finally marked as paid. I did not tell my mother the full truth that night, though I suspect, in the years since, she has guessed most of it. Some things are kinder left unspoken between a mother and daughter. I told Bilal everything eventually, over tea, months later, when he was steady enough to hear it without needing to do anything about it himself. It's done, Baba, I told him. I didn't do it the way you would have wanted, maybe. I didn't forgive him. And I'm not going to pretend I did. But I didn't become him either. I used the truth. It took a long time, but the truth was enough. The wind moved through the cemetery trees the way it always does, meaning nothing and everything at once. I still work in finance. I now run a small consultancy that specializes quietly and deliberately in helping family-owned businesses protect themselves from exactly the kind of partnership fraud that destroyed mine. My clients don't know the personal history behind my thoroughness. They only know that I ask more questions than most consultants do, and that I never, ever let a signature go unverified. My mother tends a small garden now, full of jasmine, on the tiny balcony of the apartment we eventually bought back for ourselves, not the house on Canal Road, but close enough that she says she can almost smell the old street from there on quiet evenings. Bill is a lawyer who takes on fraud cases for families who cannot afford expensive representation. He never says why. He doesn't have to. And I walk home some evenings under streetlights very similar to the ones I once studied beneath, and I think of a girl who decided, at 16 years old, that grief could either destroy her or become the most patient, disciplined engine she would ever build. It became the engine, and in the end, it was enough.